She wanted to split the bill without knowing that he was a millionaire. He took out his card naturally, as if nothing, but the waiter looked at her, denied with his head, and said something that left her completely bewildered. "I cannot accept this," said Amanda, pushing the credit card to the waiter, with so much force that he almost fell off the table, feeling how the blood rose to his face. While Robson looked at her with that expression of genuine confusion that only made things worse. Because how to explain to him that it was not about the money, but what the money meant, of all the times he had had to prove that he did not need anyone to pay for it, that he could support himself alone, although the whole world seemed designed to make him believe otherwise. The restaurant turned around with its dim lights and impeccable white tablecloths, and Amanda wanted to be anywhere else, except there, sitting in front of that man who had just revealed to her unintentionally that everything he had said in the last 2 hours was a lie, or not exactly a lie, but an omission. And the omissions were worse because they implied intention, a deliberate calculation of how much truth to share and how much to keep. And she had been sitting there, talking about her problems as an independent designer, about how sometimes customers did not pay on time and had to chase them for weeks, about that feeling of building something from scratch, without a network of security, exposing herself completely, while he felt it, with understanding, with that empathy that now seemed false, because how could someone who had a corporate account understand it in one of the most expensive restaurants in the city? Someone for whom sharing an account was probably such an abstract concept as worrying about whether the balance would reach until the end of the month. Amanda, wait. Robson extended his hand on the table without touching it, keeping it suspended in the air between them like a bridge that she did not know if she wanted to cross. And there was something in her honey-colored eyes that stopped her just when she was about to get up and get out of there, without looking back. Something that was not a plea or arrogance, but an unexpected vulnerability that did not fit with the image that had just formed of him in the last 30 seconds, since the waiter had rejected his card with that professional smile, and those words that still resonated in his ears as a sentence. "Mr. Sousa already has an open corporate account in the restaurant. It is not necessary for the lady to worry. It is not necessary for you to worry," as if worrying was optional, as if she could simply decide not to do it, and the world would adjust to that decision. And maybe for people like Robson, the world did work that way. Maybe for him, things just happened effortlessly, without that constant weight of measuring every expense, every decision, every risk. "Mr. Sousa," Amanda repeated, and her own voice sounded strange to her, controlled in a way that required more energy than she had, because what she really wanted was to scream or laugh, or both at the same time, given the absurdity of the situation, of having spent 2 hours talking to someone who had told her that she worked in a hotel, which technically was not a lie, but it was like saying that someone who owns a publishing house works with books, a truth so diluted that it became a deception. Robson lowered his hand and supported it on the table, his fingers drumming nervously on the tablecloth, in a gesture that Amanda recognized, because it was the same thing she did when she designed, and something did not go as expected. That unconscious rhythm that translated anxiety into movement. And it was that little detail, almost insignificant, what kept her in her chair, when everything in her screamed to run away. Because the people who drummed their fingers on the tables were people who were worried about something, who felt the pressure of the situations even if they had corporate accounts in elegant restaurants. "I can explain it," he said, and Amanda almost laughed at the ridiculousness of that phrase, so used in movies and telenovelas, that she had lost all real meaning. But something in her tone stopped her, a raw honesty that contrasted with the sophisticated atmosphere of the place, with the glasses of wine that shone under the lights, and the silver covers that weighed more than necessary, as if luxury had to be measured in grams. Amanda crossed her arms on her chest, a defensive gesture that she knew well, that she had perfected over the years of meetings with clients who tried to pay her less than agreed, or who questioned her work as if graphic design was something anyone could do in 5 minutes, and a YouTube tutorial, and waited because if there was something she had learned in her independent career, it was that silence had power, that sometimes the best thing was to just shut up and let the other person fill the void with their own words, revealing more than they intended. "Carla didn't tell you who I am," said Robson. And it wasn't a question, but an affirmation that Amanda confirmed with a slight head movement, feeling a mixture of anger towards her best friend and curiosity to know what else she had hidden in that apparently innocent conversation 3 days ago, when Carla had appeared in her studio with coffee, and that excessive enthusiasm she used when she wanted to convince her of something Amanda didn't want to do. The account continued on the table between them, forgotten by the waiter, who had disappeared discreetly after dropping the information bomb that had detonated this situation, and Amanda could see the total from where she was sitting, 860 pesos, which had seemed reasonable when they chose the dishes, but which now felt like evidence of an invisible gap between the two, a distance that had nothing to do with meters, but with completely different realities, with worlds that barely touched the surface, but which, deep down, operated under different rules. "I work in a hotel," continued Robson, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, a tired smile that Amanda knew, because it was the same one she used when she explained for the 10th time to a relative that being an independent graphic designer was a real job, not a hobby, until she found something better, and he took a break, breathed deeply like he was about to jump into cold water, and added with a voice that betrayed real nervousness, "I have some hotels, well, a chain, nothing compared to the big international corporations. But yes, I am the owner, and I know how that sounds. I know that right now you are recalculating every word I said in the last 2 hours, looking for deception in every sentence. But there wasn't, or at least not intentionally, because when Carla told me about you and suggested that we meet, the first thing I thought was that I didn't want to be that guy who comes to an appointment talking about his company as if it were his only interesting feature. Like those men who turn every conversation into an opportunity to impress or establish invisible hierarchies based on bank accounts. The words came out quickly, running into each other, and Amanda processed them slowly while watching how Robson passed his hand through his dark hair in a gesture of frustration that seemed genuine, too genuine to be acted, and wondered if it was possible that someone with his level of wealth could feel genuinely nervous in a situation like this, if the money really isolated him as much as he had always assumed, or if millionaires also sweated their hands when they tried to explain something important to someone they had just met. He recalled the conversation of the last 2 hours, how it had flowed with a surprising ease after the first uncomfortable minutes, how Robson had asked about his work with an interest that seemed genuine, listening really when she explained the difference between graphic design and user experience design, without that glassy look that many people adopted when she talked about typographies and color palettes, and had shared anecdotes about problems with suppliers that now charged a new meaning. Because a problem with suppliers, when you are the owner of a hotel chain, probably involved figures that she did not handle, not even in a full year of work. "Why did you accept this appointment?" Amanda asked, and the question came out harder than she intended, loaded with the weight of all the times she had felt that someone underestimated her for working from home, for not having an elegant office or a corporate title that she put on her business card, for choosing the freedom of independence over the security of a fixed salary. And Robson looked at her as if the question had taken her by surprise, as if she had expected anger or accusations, but not that direct curiosity, which cut straight to the heart of the matter. He leaned forward, supporting his elbows on the table, in a gesture that reduced the physical distance between them, although the emotional distance seemed to have multiplied exponentially in the last minutes. And Amanda noticed the little wrinkles around her eyes that spoke of someone who often smiled at night without sleeping, thinking of responsibilities that she could not imagine, of a life that was probably much more complicated than money suggested. "Because Carla told me that you were the most authentic person I knew," Robson replied, with a sincerity that struck Amanda in some vulnerable place that he did not know he had exposed. And he continued, "Before she could fully process those words, he told me that you hated pretensions, that you valued honesty above all. And I thought that maybe, only maybe, I could meet someone who saw me as Robson and not as the owner of Sousa Hotels. Someone with whom I could speak without calculating each word so as not to sound presumptuous, or without having to guess if the interest is genuine or is dyed by what I represent financially. And I know it sounds ironic coming from someone who has just been discovered, omitting important information, but I swear that my intention was not to deceive you, but simply to have a real conversation with someone real, without the layers of expectations and assumptions that usually come with my last name." Amanda felt like her anger was beginning to turn into something more complex, a mixture of reluctant understanding and resistance to be convinced so easily, because she had worked too hard to get where she was, to allow someone, no matter how sincere they seemed, to make her feel naive or easily manipulable. And at the same time, there was something in the way Robson looked at her. Without deviating or hiding behind elaborate excuses that resonated with that part of her that valued the courage of vulnerability, of admitting mistakes instead of justifying them until they became virtues. The restaurant continued at its pace around her, waiters moving between tables with practiced elegance, the murmur of other conversations creating a soundtrack of normality that contrasted with the concentrated tension in its small corner next to the window. And Amanda realized that she had reached a decision point, that moment when she could get up and end everything there, reducing the experience to an anecdote that would tell Carla with a mixture of fun and exasperation. Or she could stay and see where this conversation, that had taken a completely unexpected turn. "It's okay," finally said Amanda. And the words came out softer than I expected, loaded with a provisional acceptance that was not complete forgiveness, but not total rejection either. An intermediate space where both could breathe and recalibrate whatever was happening between them, and added with firmness that made it clear that she was not willing to give in to everything. "But I'm going to pay my part, not because you can't pay it all, or because I care to show something, but because that's how it is, how it worked, that's how I've built my life, and I'm not going to change that. Just because now I know you have a hotel chain. Do you understand?" Robson sat down slowly, and Amanda saw something similar to respect cross her expression, as if she finally understood that this was not a battle of egos, but a statement of principles. And when she called the waiter back and explained that they needed to split the bill despite their corporate account, she did it without arguing or trying to convince her. On the contrary, simply accepting her decision with a grace that Amanda did not expect. And it was that gesture, more than any word she had said before, which began to soften the defenses that she had raised instinctively around her heart. The waiter returned with 2 separate receipts and a professionally neutral expression that did not reveal if he had witnessed the tension of the last minutes, or if he had simply learned to ignore the personal dramas that were developing between the white rugs of his restaurant. And Amanda signed her receipt with a silent satisfaction that had nothing to do with the money itself, but with the feeling of having kept her ground in a situation that could easily have made her feel small or irrelevant, watching carefully how Robson did the same with his, without additional comments or gestures that could be interpreted as condescension disguised as courtesy. When the waiter left, the silence that remained between them was different from that which had existed 30 minutes before. He no longer had that slight quality of 2 people getting to know each other with the optimistic curiosity of one who still does not know if it is worth investing time in the other, but was now loaded with new information, with revelations that changed the balance of what they had built during dinner. And Amanda surprised herself without wanting to end the night there, without that impulse to flee that she had felt when everything exploded, replaced by something that seemed dangerously to the genuine curiosity about who was really the man sitting in front of her. "Do you want to walk?" asked Robson. And the question came with a naturalness that suggested that he was not ready either for the night to end on that tense and complicated note, as if both knew instinctively that they needed more time to process what had just happened, to recalibrate their initial impressions in light of this new information that had completely restructured the context of their meeting. Amanda felt before thinking too much, before her analytical mind could list all the reasons why she should simply go home and leave this experience as a strange anecdote to keep in your collection of failed dates. And she found herself following him towards the restaurant exit, noticing for the first time how several employees greeted him with respectful familiarity, small gestures of recognition that confirmed what she already knew, but that now she saw with different eyes, processing details that had previously gone unnoticed because she did not have the framework of reference to interpret them correctly. The night was cool when they went out to the street, that type of perfect temperature that the city of Mexico occasionally offered when the air had lost the heat of the day, but still did not adopt the cold of dawn. And Amanda breathed deeply while walking without a particular direction, letting her feet decide the course instead of her head, which was still processing too many things simultaneously to be reliable in decision-making. Robson kept his hands in the pockets of his pants, a casual posture that Amanda interpreted as a conscious attempt not to invade her space after what had happened, respecting a distance she needed, although she had not explicitly asked for it. And that gesture of consideration was worth more than any elaborate excuse she could have offered, because it showed that she was paying attention not only to her words, but also to her body language, to those subtle signals that most people ignored in their hurry to fix uncomfortable situations with words that often made things worse. "My grandfather started with a small hotel in Puebla," said Robson after walking half a block in silence. And Amanda understood that she was offering him context without her having asked for it, filling the blank spaces of his story because she had learned in those tense minutes in the restaurant that she valued complete information about the half-truths and continued with a voice that carried genuine affection. He was a primary school teacher, but he dreamed of having his own business, something that he could leave to his children. And for 20 years, he saved every penny he could until he finally bought an old building in the historic center and turned it into a hotel of 18 rooms that he and my grandmother managed practically alone, cleaning rooms and cooking breakfasts and learning on the go how the hotel industry worked. Amanda listened uninterruptedly, feeling how the story added layers of complexity to the simple image she had built of Robson as simply a rich man who had omitted important information. And he continued to walk while he spoke, his eyes fixed on the pavement ahead, as if he were seeing the past projected on the tiles. My father grew up working in that hotel, making the beds after school and helping at the reception on weekends. And when he inherited the business, he had the vision of expanding it. He bought 2 more properties in the tourist area and renovated them with a concept that combined colonial charm with modern comforts, something that at that time was not common and was successful, more successful than anyone expected. They turned a corner without arguing, synchronizing their steps naturally while the story continued to develop. And Amanda was imagining a Robson boy growing between hotel corridors and conversations about occupation and high seasons, learning the business in the same way that she had learned graphic design by osmosis and constant observation before it became a career decision. I grew up thinking that everyone lived like that, admitted Robson, with a humorless laugh that revealed something like retrospective shame. Surrounded by people who worked in our hotels, traveling to supervise the new properties, without really understanding that our situation was not the norm. Until I arrived at the university and began to see how my classmates lived, the concerns they had about schoolwork and textbooks, and if they could afford to eat out on weekends. And that was when I began to be more careful with what I shared about my family, not out of shame, but because I realized that money changed the way people saw me, how they interacted with me. Some became too interested, and others built walls of resentment before really knowing me, and I didn't like any of those options. Amanda processed every word, comparing them with her own experiences of growing up in a middle-class family where money had always been something that was managed carefully, where holidays were planned a year in advance to save enough, and where studying graphic design at a private university had meant that she worked part-time throughout her entire career to cover part of the expenses that her parents could not absorb completely, and wondered how it would be to live without that constant mental calculation of income versus expenses that had been the soundtrack of her adult life. If the absence of that concern freed you to think about other things, or if it simply created a different void full of worries that she could not imagine from her perspective. "I understand why you did not mention it," finally said Amanda, and the words came after several minutes of contemplative silence, with an honesty that surprised her because just an hour earlier she had been convinced that the omission was unforgivable, but listening to the complete context had smoothed its sharp edges, transforming what had seemed a calculated deception into something more like understandable self-protection. Although that did not mean that she was completely comfortable with the situation, nor that she had forgotten the initial discomfort. Robson looked at her with an expression of visible relief that she did not try to hide. And Amanda saw in her eyes something that she recognized from her own professional experiences. That genuine gratitude that comes when someone takes the time to understand your perspective instead of judging based only on superficial information. And he said softly, "But I understand why it bothered you, because basically I asked you to be completely honest about your life, while I kept a significant part of mine. And that is not fair, no matter what my intentions were." They had arrived at a small park that Amanda vaguely recognized, having passed through there, on their way to meetings with clients, one of those green spaces hidden between buildings that the city offered to those who knew how to look for them, and without consulting each other, they headed towards a bench under a tree, whose branches created intricate shadows under the yellowish light of the park's lamps, sitting with enough space between them so that it did not feel invasive, but close enough so that the conversation could continue to flow effortlessly. "What do you like to design the most?" asked Robson after a moment. And the change of subject was so deliberate that Amanda almost smiled at the obvious attempt to move the conversation to a more neutral ground, but decided to follow the flow because she did not want to spend the whole night dissecting what had gone wrong in the restaurant, preferring to explore what could be good between them if the opportunity arose. I think of the question while watching a young couple walking a dog in the distance, considering all the answers they had given over the years when clients or acquaintances asked the same question. The professional answers on creative expression and resolution of visual problems. But something at the time pushed her to a deeper truth that she rarely shared, because it required vulnerability that she was not always willing to offer. "I like to create order from chaos," she finally replied, her words coming out slowly like someone exploring unknown territory. "When a client arrives with a confusing idea or a business without a clear visual identity, and I can take all those scattered elements and find the essence of what they are trying to communicate, transforming it into something that makes sense visually, that tells its story so that people can understand it immediately. There is something deeply satisfying in that, in taking the intangible and making it tangible and functional." Robson listened carefully, that Amanda could feel physically, not the polite listening that people offer while waiting for their turn to speak, but the real listening that absorbs every word and processes them genuinely. And when she spoke, her voice was understandable. It is similar to what I do with hotels. Although it sounds strange to compare it because every property we acquire has its own personality and unique problems. And my job is to find the way to transform it into a space that works for both guests and employees, respecting the original structure, but modernizing it in ways that improve the experience without destroying what made it special in the first place. Amanda really looked at it for the first time since they had left the restaurant, noticing details that had gone over the top in the middle of the previous tension. The way in which his hands gestured subtly when he spoke of his work, revealing genuine passion that transcended the financial aspect of the business. And he found herself reconsidering his initial assumptions about who this man was and what the company he had inherited and expanded. "Have you ever wanted to do something different?" Amanda, genuinely curious, now asked. And Robson laughed with a real laugh that completely transformed his face, making him appear years younger and considerably less intimidating, and replied, "All the time when I was a teenager, I wanted to be an architect and design buildings from scratch instead of renewing those that already existed. But when the time came to choose a career, I realized that I loved family business too much to leave it. I realized that there was something to continue, What my grandfather began to call me, stronger than to start something completely new. Although sometimes I wonder how it would have been to take that other path. Honesty in his response resonated with Amanda in an unexpected way, reminding him of his own professional crossroads. The moments when he had considered accepting corporate jobs with stable salaries instead of maintaining his precarious independence, and how each time he had chosen freedom over security despite the price he paid in stress and sleepless nights, and realized that perhaps difficult decisions did not depend on the size of the bank account, but on deeper values that transcended economic circumstances. Amanda woke up the next day with the strange feeling of having dreamed all night, although he did not remember any specific dream. Only that residual impression of constant movement and conversations that extended beyond reason, and it took several seconds to process that. What he had dreamed was actually a fragmented memory of the previous night, of how she and Robson had remained in that park talking until the cold finally forced them to move, walking others 6 blocks, while the conversation jumped from subject to subject, with that surprising ease that only happens when two people discover unexpected synchronies in their ways of seeing the world. The light entered through the window of his apartment with that particular quality of Saturday mornings, soft and without urgency, and Amanda lay down looking at the ceiling while mentally reproducing fragments of the conversation, the things he had shared about his decision to work independently after 3 years in an agency where he felt more and more like a replaceable piece in a machinery that did not care about his creative vision, and how Robson had understood that need for autonomy in a way that she did not expect, admitting that sometimes envied that. Freedom to make decisions without having to consider the impact on hundreds of employees whose lives depended on the choices he made daily. The phone vibrated on the table at night, taking it out of his thoughts, and Amanda reached it waiting to see some work message. Because Saturdays rarely meant real rest when you were freelance, and customers assumed that you were available any day of the week. But instead of that, he found a message from Carla, whose text in capital letters practically screamed from the screen. I need all the details, immediately followed by a series of emojis that included hearts, question marks, and what seemed to be a face with heart eyes, and Amanda felt a mixture of fun and exasperation before the enthusiasm of her friend, who had probably been awake since 6 a.m, waiting for news about how the date she had orchestrated had turned out, wrote a short answer that said, "Coffee at 11 your house there. I tell you because there were things that could not be communicated properly by text message shades and tones that were lost in the digital translation, and also needed to process better their own feelings about what had happened before trying to explain it to someone else, especially Carla, who tended to romanticize situations and jump to optimistic conclusions that did not always align with the most complicated reality of how human relations worked. Finally got up after 20 minutes of horizontal contemplation, heading to the shower, while his mind continued processing and went under where he admitted to himself something that he had been avoiding recognizing since they said goodbye the night before he liked Robson. Not in that superficial way that someone can like you because it is attractive or charming, but in a deeper and potentially problematic way that involved genuinely enjoying his company, find his way of thinking interesting, feel real curiosity for knowing more about him, despite all the complications that represented his economic situation that was so radically different from his. And there was the real problem, thought Amanda while soaping her hair, was not that Robson had money, but all the dynamics of power and expectations that came with that. Difference. How could it affect the way they related if she would be able to maintain her independence and her principles when she was with someone for whom money was simply not a consideration in most of the decisions he made, if he could really understand the pressures and limitations that defined a large part of his daily life, or if eventually that gap would become too large to be navigated without resentment on either side. She got out of the shower without having resolved anything but feeling at least more awake and capable of facing the interrogation that Carla undoubtedly had prepared, dressing in jeans and a comfortable sweatshirt, because Saturdays were sacred in her personal calendar as the only days where she didn't have to worry about looking professional for anyone, and she was making herself a coffee when the phone vibrated again, this time with a message from a number she didn't have saved but recognized immediately because she had seen it the night before when they exchanged contacts before parting, a gesture that had seemed natural at the moment, but that now filled her with an anticipatory anxiety she hadn't felt in years, since before she became so pragmatic about dates and relationships and stopped investing emotional expectations in people she barely knew. Robson's message was simple and direct. Good morning. I hope it's not too early to write. I just wanted to say that I really enjoyed the conversation last night, and I would like to see you again if you want to too, without pressure. And Amanda read the message 3 times, looking for subtexts or red flags that her experience had taught her to identify, but she found nothing more than the same direct honesty he had shown the night before, when he finally stopped omitting and started sharing complete truths. She responded after 10 minutes of internal deliberation about the right tone, writing and deleting versions until settling on, I enjoyed it too. And yes, I would like to see you again, although we should probably talk more about how this would work, considering our different situations. And she sent the message before she could regret her typically direct honesty that sometimes scared people, but that she had decided years ago was preferable to pretending to be someone she wasn't. The response came almost immediately, as if Robson had been waiting with the phone in his hand, and it said, "It seems perfect to talk about that. In fact, I prefer it. Do you have time today? Or is it too soon?" And Amanda surprised herself, wanting to say yes immediately. Even though she had plans with Carla and 3 projects waiting for attention, but something in the urgency of his message, in that willingness to address complications directly instead of ignoring them, hoping they would magically resolve themselves, resonated with her own need for clarity before investing more time and emotional energy in something that might be destined to fail for structural reasons that no amount of personal chemistry could overcome. I have plans at 11, but I could in the afternoon. 3 in the afternoon works for you, wrote Amanda. And when he confirmed, suggesting a small coffee shop she knew in Colonia Condesa, one of those unpretentious places that served good coffee without charging ridiculous prices for the privilege of drinking it in artisanal cups, she felt a small victory in the fact that he had chosen that place instead of some elegant establishment with his name at the entrance, as if he were proving that he had really listened when she spoke about her values and what mattered to her. She arrived at Carla's house exactly at 11, ringing the bell 3 times in her usual pattern, and her friend opened the door with a huge smile that foreshadowed exactly the kind of exhausting but necessary conversation Amanda had anticipated entering the apartment she knew as well as her own after 10 years of friendship. that had survived job changes, moves, failed relationships on both sides, and all the accumulated weight of becoming functional adults in a city that didn't make that process easy for anyone. "Tell me everything, and don't you dare omit a single detail," demanded Carla, before Amanda could even sit on the familiar sofa covered with the woven blanket her friend had bought in an artisanal market in Oaxaca. And Amanda laughed at the irony of that demand, considering that the whole situation of the night before had revolved around omissions and revelations, letting herself fall onto the sofa while accepting the cup of tea Carla offered her. Chamomile tea that her friend insisted was good for the nerves, although Amanda had never confirmed if that was true, or simply one of those myths people perpetuated without questioning. She began the story from the moment she arrived at the restaurant, describing the initial dinner before everything exploded, and Carla listened with that absolute attention that was one of her best qualities as a friend, without interrupting or judging, prematurely, simply absorbing the information, while her expression fluctuated between concern and curiosity. And when Amanda reached the part where the waiter rejected her card, revealing Robson's identity, Carla made a grimace that confirmed she had known from the beginning who he was, and had deliberately chosen not to share that information. "You knew?" said Amanda. And it wasn't a question, but a soft accusation, and Carla had at least the decency to look guilty while explaining her reasoning. Saying she had thought that if Amanda knew from the beginning that Robson was the owner of a hotel chain, she would never have accepted the date. She would have built defensive walls based on assumptions about who he was, without giving him the chance to really know him. And although Amanda wanted to be angry with that logic, she couldn't completely deny that her friend was probably right. That if she had known, she would have politely declined the invitation using work as an excuse, saving herself the stress, but also missing out on the possibility of connecting with someone who had turned out to be considerably more interesting and complex than his financial situation suggested. She continued with the story, describing the conversation in the park and how she had begun to understand the pressures and complications that came with Robson's position, and Carla listened, nodding occasionally until Amanda reached the present to the messages from that morning and the plan to see each other again that afternoon to speak specifically about how their differences could affect any potential relationship that might develop between them. "I like your approach," said Carla after a moment of consideration. "It's very you to address this directly instead of simply seeing what happens and hoping complications resolve themselves. Although I warn you that sometimes overanalyzing things can kill something that might work if you just gave it space to develop organically." Amanda knew her friend had a valid point because that had always been her tendency. That need to completely understand variables before committing emotionally to something, a defense mechanism developed after previous relationships that had failed precisely because she hadn't asked the hard questions at the beginning, assuming mutual affection would be enough to navigate fundamental differences in values and life expectations. But experience had taught her that some gaps were too wide to be crossed only with good intentions and physical chemistry. They spent the next hour talking about all possible scenarios, the ways economic difference could manifest in daily conflicts, from decisions about where to eat to expectations about travel and lifestyle, and Carla played the role of devil's advocate when Amanda got too pessimistic, reminding her that she had seen Robson interact with people in professional contexts, and he had never shown that arrogance or lack of awareness that sometimes characterized people accustomed to economic privilege. Amanda arrived at the cafe 15 minutes before 3, a habit she had developed over years of meetings with clients, where arriving first meant having time to prepare mentally and choose the strategic seat that gave you psychological advantages in negotiations. Although this wasn't a negotiation, but something much more complicated that didn't have a protocol established in any professional etiquette manual she had read. The place was moderately full with the typical Saturday afternoon crowd students, with laptops occupying individual tables, couples sharing desserts, a group of friends laughing in the corner, and Amanda chose a table by the window, overlooking the tree-lined street, ordering an Americano, while she waited and watched people pass outside, wondering how many of those people walking with their apparently simple lives also carried invisible complications that no one could guess just by looking at them superficially. Robson appeared exactly at 3, and Amanda noticed he had also changed his appearance from the elegant restaurant the night before, wearing jeans and a casual shirt that made him look more accessible, less intimidating, as if he too had thought strategically about the image he wanted to project for this conversation, and that consideration moved her in a way she didn't expect, because it showed he was also nervous about this meeting, that he didn't assume everything would simply work out, because he was used to things working out in his favor. He sat across from her after ordering his own coffee, and the initial silence between them was loaded, but not uncomfortable. Rather, it was the kind of pause that precedes important conversations, where both people are calibrating how to start without sounding defensive or aggressive, looking for that middle tone that allowed honesty without hurting unnecessarily. "Thanks for agreeing to come," said Robson. Finally, his hands wrapped around the coffee cup, as if he needed something to do with them to control his nervousness. And Amanda nodded slightly before responding with a question she had been formulating mentally the whole way from Carla's house to here, a question that cut straight to the center of her concerns, without diplomatic detours that would only prolong the discomfort. "What do you really want from this?" asked Amanda, and her voice came out softer than she had planned, but maintaining that firmness indicating she expected a real answer, not comforting platitudes designed to avoid conflict. Because if they were going to do this, she needed to know he was as committed to uncomfortable honesty as she was, that he wouldn't back down when conversations got difficult, as they inevitably would, if they continued seeing each other. Robson took a sip of his coffee, clearly using those seconds to organize his thoughts. And when he spoke, his answer arrived with a vulnerability Amanda was starting to recognize as characteristically that willingness to expose himself emotionally that seemed to contradict the stereotypes she had held about people in his position. "I want to really know you," he said. And before Amanda could fully process those words, he continued developing his thought, not just spend pleasant time together or have interesting conversations. "Although those things matter to me too, but understand how you think. What motivates you? What are the things that keep you awake at night worrying? And what are the ones that make you feel all the effort is worth it?" And I know it sounds intense for someone I've barely known for a day, but something in our conversation last night made me feel that I don't want to do this in the superficial way, where we pretend differences between us don't exist or don't matter, until eventually they become problems so big we can't ignore them. Amanda felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she hadn't known she was carrying until Robson's words released her. because he was articulating exactly what she had been feeling, but didn't know how to express without sounding too serious or scaring him with expectations that might seem premature. Considering, technically, they barely knew each other. "I'm afraid of losing you before really knowing you," admitted Amanda. And the words came out without the usual filter. She applied to her thoughts before vocalizing them that raw honesty she rarely shared, because it made her feel exposed in ways that weren't always comfortable. And she continued before she could regret it, because I've seen how money complicates things, not necessarily in obvious or dramatic ways, but in small ways that accumulate over time. Differences in what we consider luxuries versus necessities, in how we make decisions about spending or saving, in the pressures we feel about our personal worth based on our ability to provide or contribute financially. And I don't know how to navigate that with someone whose economic reality is so different from mine without eventually feeling I'm falling short or you're being condescending. Even if it's not your intention, Robson listened, without interrupting his expression, showing he was processing every word genuinely, instead of simply waiting his turn to refute her concerns. And when he finally spoke after Amanda finished, his response didn't try to minimize what she had expressed, but validate it while offering his own complementary perspective. "Everything you said is valid. And honestly, I don't have perfect answers because I've never been in a situation like this," said Robson, his tone reflective and careful. "Most of my previous relationships have been with people coming from contexts similar to mine or who knew from the beginning about my financial situation. And that created its own series of problems, doubts about whether they really cared about me or what I represent economically. That constant feeling of having to question motives that were probably genuine, but money contaminated with suspicion. And maybe that sounds like a privilege problem because it is, but it doesn't make it less real or less lonely when you're in the middle of it." Amanda understood what he was trying to express, recognizing the irony that both faced opposite versions of the same fundamental problem, how money, or the lack of it, complicated authenticity in relationships, creating power dynamics and distrust difficult to disarm, even when both people had good intentions and genuine compatibility. "So, how do we do this?" asked Amanda, because that was the practical question remaining unanswered after all the emotional honesty they had shared. And Robson smiled with a mixture of relief and nervousness, suggesting he was as out of his element as she was. "I think we have to establish rules," proposed Robson, and Amanda raised an eyebrow at the formality of the suggestion, although internally she appreciated the structured approach because her analytical mind worked better with clear parameters than romantic ambiguity. And he continued explaining his thought, not rigid rules that kill spontaneity, but agreements on how to handle situations where our economic differences could create conflict, like who pays for what and when, what kind of activities we do together that respect both budgets, how to communicate when something bothers us, without letting resentment accumulate silently until exploding. Amanda considered the proposal while finishing her coffee, appreciating that Robson wasn't trying to solve all potential problems immediately, but proposing a framework to navigate together the unknown territory their situation represented. And after a moment, she nodded, indicating she was willing to explore that possibility. "Okay, let's start simple," said Amanda. "When we go out, everyone pays for themselves, unless we specifically agree otherwise beforehand. No surprises or grandiose gestures, making me feel uncomfortable or indebted. And if you want to do something exceeding my budget, you have to say it before so I can decide if it's something I want to spend my money on, or if you prefer to invite me being completely transparent about it. Instead of assuming, Robson nodded immediately, without hesitation or signs of offense at the directness of her terms, and added his own condition. And I need you to tell me when something bothers you related to money or differences between us, without keeping it to yourself out of pride or not wanting to seem sensitive, because I prefer 1,000 times having uncomfortable conversations than discovering months later that something I did, without realizing, hurt you or made you feel less valued. They continued developing these agreements during the next hour conversation, flowing between serious and light, establishing boundaries, but also exploring possibilities, discovering that despite their differences, they shared fundamental values about honesty and mutual respect that could serve as a base for something deeper if both were willing to do the work of maintaining open communication when complications arose. Amanda surprised herself laughing at various moments when Robson made self-deprecating comments about his own social awkwardness, learned from growing up in circles where certain topics were never discussed directly, and he seemed genuinely relieved to be with someone who didn't expect him to be perfect or have all the answers just because he had financial resources. When they finally left the cafe, it had already gotten dark outside time, passing faster than either had noticed, and they walked without particular aim through the streets of Condesa, while the conversation continued naturally less loaded now that they had established those basic parameters, giving them structure without rigidity. "What are you doing tomorrow?" asked Robson when they arrived, where Amanda had parked her car, and she thought of the 3 projects waiting on her computer, of the emails she had to answer, and the quotes she had to prepare. But she also thought of how she had felt the last few hours, that lightness coming from genuine connection with someone who seemed to really see her, instead of just seeing a superficial version she presented to the world. "I work in the morning, but I could be free in the afternoon if you promise not to try to impress me with something expensive," replied Amanda, with a smile softening the words. And Robson laughed, accepting the implicit challenge of planning something authentic to both instead of defaulting toward options his budget allowed, but didn't necessarily reflect who he really was beyond his bank account. 3 weeks had passed since that conversation in the cafe, and Amanda was discovering that navigating a relationship with explicit parameters was simultaneously easier and more complicated than she had anticipated. Easier because eliminating ambiguity about financial expectations removed a constant source of anxiety that had sabotaged previous relationships, but more complicated because every interaction required a level of conscious communication that was emotionally exhausting, although necessary, that constant verification that both felt comfortable with decisions that in other circumstances would have been automatic or irrelevant. She was sitting at her desk a Tuesday afternoon, pretending to work on the redesign of a logo for a local bakery, while actually staring at the screen without really seeing the sketches she had created that morning, her mind wandering toward the message Robson had sent an hour before, asking if she wanted to accompany him on Saturday to the opening of his newest hotel in Querétaro, an event he had described casually as something small with some investors and key staff, but that Amanda knew instinctively would be anything but small, considering the scale his company operated on. The invitation had made her uncomfortable in ways she was still trying to articulate for herself, not because she didn't want to spend time with Robson, but because it represented crossing a threshold into his professional world, where she would inevitably feel out of place, surrounded by people speaking in terms of investments and profit margins, while she mentally calculated if she could afford to buy a dress appropriate for the event without compromising her budget to pay her share of next month's rent. She had developed a strange relationship with clothes in recent weeks, that new awareness that her functional wardrobe of an independent designer working from home didn't necessarily translate well to the spaces Robson inhabited naturally, and she hated that awareness because it implied she was letting external differences affect her sense of self-worth, something she had sworn not to allow when they established their initial agreements about how to handle their relationship. The phone vibrated again, taking her out of her circular thoughts, and this time it was Carla, writing in her characteristically direct tone, "Stop overthinking it and just tell him what you're feeling." Literally, that's what you established all that structure of honest communication for. And Amanda laughed at how predictable it was for her friend, who knew her well enough to know when she was trapped in spirals of over-analysis paralyzing her instead of helping her make productive decisions. She closed the logo file without saving changes. She hadn't really made anyway, deciding it was useless to feign productivity when her brain was clearly elsewhere, and instead opened a message conversation with Robson, writing and deleting 3 different versions before settling on something, capturing her ambivalence without sounding dramatic or demanding. "I would like to go with you to Querétaro, but honestly, the idea of meeting your people in such a formal context makes me nervous. I'm not sure how to fit into that environment, and I don't want to embarrass you being the person who clearly doesn't belong there." She pressed send before she could regret that leap of faith requiring vulnerability that still didn't feel completely natural. Although they had agreed precisely this type of honesty as fundamental for their relationship to work, Robson's response arrived faster than expected, and Amanda could imagine he was probably in the middle of some meeting, checking his phone discreetly under the table, as he had admitted doing frequently when waiting to hear from her first. "I love that you told me this, instead of simply inventing an excuse or saying yes and feeling miserable the whole event second. There is no way you could embarrass me, because you are incredibly interesting and talented, and anyone who knows you 10 minutes is going to notice. And third, I completely understand your nerves, and we can talk about how to make this more comfortable for you, or simply not go. If you prefer, it's not mandatory." Amanda read the message several times, absorbing not just the words, but the underlying tone communicating. His feelings mattered more than any business event, and felt that familiar loosening in her chest occurring when Robson responded to her vulnerabilities with validation instead of minimization, that pattern he had established consistently in recent weeks and was slowly eroding her habitual defenses against trusting someone too quickly, that Robson responded better to direct transparency than vague implications, leaving him guessing. His answer arrived after several minutes. Amanda spent nervously biting the inside of her cheek, a habit she had developed in childhood and never managed to eliminate completely. "Let's have lunch tomorrow and talk about all that, and about clothes. I have an idea, but I need you to trust me and not get immediately defensive when I tell you." And Amanda felt simultaneously curiosity and apprehension at that warning, suggesting whatever he had in mind would probably challenge her boundaries about accepting help in ways involving money. They met the next day at a traditional Mexican food restaurant. Amanda had suggested specifically because prices were reasonable and food was authentic. One of those places not appearing in tourist guides, but locals knew and appreciated, and Robson had accepted without comments, on the contrast with elegant restaurants, where he probably ate when having business meetings. He arrived wearing jeans and a casual shirt Amanda recognized because she had seen it on him several times, and appreciated he never tried to impress her with expensive clothes or ostentatious accessories, maintaining a style functional and comfortable rather than designed to communicate economic status. They ordered tacos al pastor and aguas frescas, falling into that easy conversation that had become characteristic between them, updating on the last days before addressing the heavier topic, bringing them together. And Amanda noticed how Robson asked specifically about the bakery logo project, remembering details she had mentioned casually days ago about challenges, capturing the artisanal essence of the business in a simple design, that kind of attention demonstrating he really listened when she spoke about her work, instead of just waiting politely for her to finish, so he could talk about his own affairs. So about Querétaro, began Robson after they finished eating his tone. Careful in a way Amanda had learned to recognize as precursor to something he knew might be sensitive. The event is semi-formal, which basically means men wear suits without ties, and women wear dresses or elegant outfits, but nothing excessively formal, like galas or evening gowns. And there will be mainly people from the hotel industry, some investors, the administrative team of the new hotel, probably between 50 and 70 people total. Amanda nodded, processing information, while mentally calculating the cost of an appropriate semi-formal dress versus what she had in her closet that might work with correct accessories. And Robson continued, before she could start proposing solutions. My sister, Daniela, works with me, managing the interior design and guest experience part. And when I mentioned you would come, she offered to help with the outfit because she has access to samples from designers sending her to consider for hotels' clothes. Eventually, donated or discarded, but in perfect condition. And I thought maybe you could meet with her and see if there is something you like, without implying spending money you prefer using for other things. The suggestion floated between them, while Amanda processed its multiple layers, recognizing Robson had clearly thought carefully about how to present this in a way minimizing implication of charity while offering practical solution to problem she had articulated. And her first instinct was to reject it, because accepting borrowed clothes from his sister felt dangerously close to depending on his money. Although technically it wasn't. I know what you're thinking, said Robson softly, his eyes meeting hers, with that combination of understanding and patience he had demonstrated repeatedly when navigating these complicated situations. And I understand if you prefer finding your own solution, but this genuinely isn't charity or an attempt to make you feel you can't handle it on your own. Daniela really does this regularly with friends and colleagues because she accumulates more clothes than she can use and likes seeing it on people who appreciate it instead of ending up stored indefinitely. Amanda considered his expression, looking for signs of condescension or pity, making it impossible to accept offer without resentment, but only found genuine sincerity. And that vulnerability he showed, when really caring, she said yes to something without feeling compromised. Does she know about us? Asked Amanda, because that information would change context of interaction completely, determining if Daniela would be evaluating her as potential partner for her brother, or simply as someone needing a borrowed dress. And Robson nodded, confirming I told her I was dating someone I liked a lot and who had strong principles about financial independence. I completely respect, so she understands this is about facilitating you at the event without creating unnecessary tension around clothes, not about impressing you with access to expensive things. The honesty of that explanation, the fact he had spoken to his sister specifically about her values and contextualized offer in a way protecting her dignity, moved Amanda more than words alone justified, and found herself nodding, slowly accepting, meeting Daniela, although still feeling uncomfortable with whole situation in ways she couldn't articulate completely, because involving layers of pride and vulnerability even she didn't totally understand. "Okay," she said finally, "but if when I meet her, she makes me feel like a charity project or treats me with condescension, I leave immediately and will find my own solution." "Agreed?" Robson smiled with genuine relief and agreed without arguing, respecting her boundaries even when probably thinking they were excessive. And it was that respect finally convincing her. Maybe she could do this without compromising principles she had established to protect herself. The meeting with Daniela had turned out to be surprisingly easy without implicit judgment or condescension. Amanda had feared. Just a 35-year-old woman with contagious energy, speaking passionately about textures and colors while pulling dresses from a closet, seeming endless, commenting on each piece with anecdotes about designers and fashion fairs, never making Amanda feel less for not knowing those names or worlds. And when finally finding a navy blue dress with simple but elegant cut fitting perfectly, Daniela had said with genuine sincerity, it looked better on Amanda than on any of the models wearing it in original presentations. Now, standing in front of the mirror in her apartment Saturday morning, wearing that dress and hair gathered in a bun she had seen in a YouTube tutorial, Amanda allowed herself to admit she looked good, not like an imposter, pretending to be someone she wasn't, but like a version of herself, simply choosing to dress elegantly for special occasion. And that distinction mattered more than she could explain to someone never feeling that dissonance between who you were and how you presented to the world. Robson arrived to pick her up exactly at agreed time, driving himself instead of sending a chauffeur, as Amanda half expected he would. And when she opened door, his expression was of admiration. So genuine, Amanda felt heat rising to her cheeks in a way not experienced in years. That kind of adolescent shyness thought overcome decades ago, but apparently could resurface when someone looked at you as if you were only person in universe mattering in that moment. "You look incredible," said Robson, and words were simple, but tone carried emotional weight, transcending superficial compliment. And Amanda responded with smile, half gratitude and half residual nervousness about what awaited in coming hours. The trip to Querétaro took almost 3 hours with traffic. Time spent talking about everything and nothing, listening to music, both discovering they like stopping at intermediate point for coffee and stretching legs. And Amanda appreciated Robson wasn't using trip to prepare her exhaustively on how to behave, or who to talk to, trusting she could navigate situation with her own social intelligence without needing detailed script, only increasing anxiety. When finally arriving at hotel, Amanda had to admit it was impressive in ways transcending obvious luxury of materials and architecture. There was something in how it was designed, communicating genuine attention to human experience, spaces inviting to stay without feeling overwhelming, lighting warm without being excessive details, revealing care without shouting cost, and found herself genuinely curious about process, creating something like that, decisions taken and rejected, how balanced functionality with aesthetics. "Do you want me to give you a quick tour before guests start arriving?" offered Robson. And Amanda accepted, grateful for those additional minutes to acclimatize to space before having to socialize with strangers, probably evaluating her as boss's new girlfriend. Although that word hadn't been officially used between them to define what they were walked through corridors, while Robson explained design decisions with enthusiasm, revealing how much he cared about every detail, pointing out how preserved original architectural elements of colonial building, while integrating modern technology discreet ways, and Amanda surprised asking technical questions about proportion and spatial flow coming from her own experience with graphic design applying unexpectedly to architecture, and Robson responding with genuine interest in her perspective, as if opinions had value, even without formal credentials. In field guests began arriving, gradually filling lobby, with overlapping conversations and polite laughter, and Amanda prepared mentally for hours, smiling politely, listening to conversations about occupancy rates and expansion strategies, not naturally including her. But Robson kept hand on lower back in way communicating both connection and silent support, introducing her to each person as Amanda Martin's independent graphic designer, without qualifiers or explanations about relationship, making her feel defined only by connection to him. Met Daniela again, greeting with warm hug, surprising Amanda, but accepted, and then Robson's father, older man with kind eyes, asking about work with interests, seeming genuine instead of obligatory, courtesy, listening attentively when explaining creative process, developing visual identities for small businesses, making intelligent connections, with own experience building hotel brand, demonstrating really processing. What she said, "My son told me that you are very direct about your principles," commented Mr. Sousa, with smile suggesting approval rather than criticism. That is rare in my experience. Most people say what they think you want to hear, especially when differences of resources involved. So I respect you keeping your ground, even when probably easier, simply accepting whatever Robson offers. Words surprised Amanda, both by perception and frankness, and responded with honesty matching his, "I don't know if it's so much about principles as about protecting myself. I've seen how money changes dynamics between people, and I don't want to get lost in that. I need to know if this works. It's because we genuinely care about each other, not because convenient or comfortable for either." Robson's father nodded thoughtfully, and Amanda saw where son inherited capacity to really listen instead of just waiting to talk, and said something resonating with her long after conversation ended. Money is a tool. It can build or destroy depending on how used and what values guide decisions, and seems you two are learning to use it consciously instead of letting it use you. That is more mature than most people achieve in lifetime. Night progressed with formal speeches Robson gave with professional confidence, contrasting interestingly with vulnerability shown private, and Amanda found herself seeing him new eyes, understanding dimensions of who was not apparent in cafes and parks where spent majority time together, and something settled in chest certainty, resisting because requiring trusting not only Robson but own capacity navigate unknown territory without losing identity process. When speeches ended and music began playing softly, background Robson found among crowd dispersed groups, talking extended hand with question eyes, needing no words. Amanda took letting guide towards quieter corner space where could talk without shouting over ambient noise. "How do you feel?" asked Robson, and question carried weight, because both knew this night had been test. Weather could really work when different worlds collided, directly. And Amanda considered answer carefully because mattered more than simply reassuring, with comforting platitudes, scared, admitted finally with honesty, characterizing her because this worked better than expected, and that means I have to stop protecting myself preemptively and really try this without reservations, and that gives fear, because means can get hurt if doesn't work, but also means can miss something real. If don't try completely. Robson looked with intensity. Amanda seen before, but now understood better way. Seeing really without filters, preconceived expectations when spoke a voice, carried emotion, rarely allowed public spaces, maintaining professional posture. I am also scared because you matter, ways didn't expect when Carla convinced accept date, and because first time, years feel someone sees as Robson, instead owner, Sousa Hotels, and don't want ruin being careless or assuming money can solve problems requiring more than financial solutions. Amanda felt tears, stinging eyes, emotion overflowing after weeks maintaining careful control, feelings protecting against premature emotional investment. Allowed, finally, admit, voice loud, what been denying, recognize even self. I am falling in love with you, and that terrifies me, but also excites ways. Haven't felt so long forgotten, how felt want genuinely, something work instead, just waitin'. Fail eventually. Robson closed distance hands, framing face tenderness, contrasting intensity. Eyes said, voice trembling slightly, revealing own vulnerability. I already fell in love with you. I think it started that first night when insisted paying part, although clearly upset because saw strength, integrity, knew someone special, someone wouldn't let anyone define except own choices, kissed. Then soft, deeply, kiss, sealing promises, unspoken, trying, really build something together. Despite complications, differences inevitably have continued navigating. Separated, Amanda surprised, laughing through tears, finally escaped laugh, relief, joy, sensation, intoxicating, surrendering, finally something been resisting, all defenses carefully built. Then what do we do now? Asked Amanda, and question, both practical, existential. Robson smiled, mixture confidence, nervousness, come love without realizing. Responded, we continue doing exactly what we've been doing, talking honestly when things get difficult, respecting boundaries, other building, something real, step, without assuming love solves automatically all differences, probably stumbling occasionally, but getting up together every time. Amanda nodded, feeling peace settle, chest replacing, constant anxiety, carried weeks said conviction, surprise even herself. I can do that, we can do that, and we are going to be fine because both want this work, right reasons. Robson kissed again, briefer this time, no less significant, returned event, holding hands. Amanda felt different, not because resolved, all insecurities or differences disappeared magically, but because chosen, finally, trust love, built honesty, respect, conscious effort could be enough. Navigate complication, future, brought choice, shared leap, faith, real beginning. Something both knew was worth. Every difficult conversation and every vulnerability exposed in the process of getting here.